Military strategy is a set of ideas implemented by military organizations to pursue desired strategic goals. Derived from the Greek word strategos, the term strategy, when it appeared in use during the 18th century, was seen in its narrow sense as the art of the general, or the art of arrangement of troops. Military strategy deals with the planning and conduct of campaigns, the movement and disposition of forces, and the deception of the enemy. The father of Western modern strategic studies, Karl von Clausewitz, 1780–1831, defined military strategy as the employment of battles to gain the end of war. B. H. Liddell Hart's definition put less emphasis on battles, defining strategy as the art of distributing and applying military means to fulfill the ends of policy. Hence, both gave the preeminence to political aims over military goals. Sun Tzu, 544–496 BC, is often considered as the father of Eastern military strategy and greatly influenced Chinese, Japanese, Korean and Vietnamese historical and modern war tactics. The Art of War by Sun Tzu grew in popularity and saw practical use in Western society as well. It continues to influence many competitive endeavors in Asia, Europe, and America, including culture, politics, and business, as well as modern warfare. The Eastern military strategy differs from the Western by focusing more on asymmetric warfare and deception. Strategy differs from tactics, in that strategy refers to the employment of all of a nation's military capabilities through high-level and long-term planning, development, and procurement to guarantee security or victory. Tactics is the military science employed to secure objectives defined as part of the military strategy, especially the methods whereby men, equipment, aircraft, ships, and weapons are employed and directed against an enemy. Fundamentals. Military strategy is the planning and execution of the contest between groups of armed adversaries. Strategy, which is a subdiscipline of warfare and of foreign policy, is a principal tool to secure national interests. It is larger in perspective than military tactics, which involves the disposition and maneuver of units on a particular sea or battlefield, but less broad than grand strategy, otherwise called national strategy, which is the overarching strategy of the largest of organizations such as the nation-state, confederation, or international alliance, and involves using diplomatic, informational, military and economic resources. Military strategy involves using military resources such as people, equipment, and information against the opponent's resources to gain supremacy or reduce the opponent's will to fight, developed through the precepts of military science. NATO's definition of strategy is presenting the manner in which military power should be developed and applied to achieve national objectives or those of a group of nations. Strategy may be divided into grand strategy, geopolitical in scope, and military strategy that converts the geopolitical policy objectives into militarily achievable goals and campaigns. Field Marshal Viscount Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff and CO Chairman of the Anglo-US Combined Chiefs of Staff Committee for most of the Second World War, described the art of military strategy as, to derive from the aim a series of military objectives to be achieved, to assess these objectives as to the military requirements they create, and the preconditions which the achievement of each is likely to necessitate, to measure available and potential resources against the requirements and to chart from this process a coherent pattern of priorities and a rational course of action. Field Marshal Montgomery summed it up thus: strategy is the art of distributing and applying military means, such as armed forces and supplies, to fulfill the ends of policy. Tactics means the dispositions for, and control of, military forces and techniques in actual fighting. Put more shortly, strategy is the art of the conduct of war, tactics the art of fighting. Background. Military strategy in the 19th century was still viewed as one of a trivium of arts or sciences that govern the conduct of warfare, the others being tactics, the execution of plans and maneuvering of forces in battle, and logistics, the maintenance of an army. The view had prevailed since the Roman times, and the borderline between strategy and tactics at this time was blurred, and sometimes categorization of a decision is a matter of almost personal opinion. Carnot, during the French Revolutionary Wars, thought it simply involved concentration of troops. Strategy and tactics are closely related and exist on the same continuum. Modern thinking places the operational level between them. All deal with distance, time, and force, but strategy is large-scale, can endure through years, and is societal, while tactics are small-scale and involve the disposition of fewer elements enduring hours to weeks. Originally, strategy was understood to govern the prelude to a battle, while tactics controlled its execution. However, in the world wars of the 20th century, the distinction between maneuver and battle, strategy and tactics, expanded with the capacity of technology and transit. Tactics that were once the province of a company of cavalry would be applied to a panzer army. It is often said that the art of strategies defines the goals to achieve in a military campaign, while tactics defines the methods to achieve these goals. Strategic goals could be: we want to conquer area X, or we want to stop country Y's expansion in world trade in commodity Z, while tactical decisions range from a general statement, e.g., we're going to do this by a naval invasion of the north of country X, we're going to blockade the ports of country Y, to a more specific: C platoon will attack while D platoon provides fire cover. In its purest form, strategy dealt solely with military issues. In earlier societies, a king or political leader was often the same person as the military leader. If not, the distance of communication between the political and the military leader was small. But as the need of a professional army grew, the bounds between the politicians and the military came to be recognized. In many cases, it was decided that there was a need for a separation. As French statesman Georges Clemenceau said, "War is too important a business to be left to soldiers." This gave rise to the concept of the grand strategy, which encompasses the management of the resources of an entire nation in the conduct of warfare. In the environment of the grand strategy, the military component is largely reduced to operational strategy, the planning and control of large military units such as corps and divisions. As the size and number of the armies grew and the technology to communicate and control improved, the difference between military strategy and grand strategy shrank. Fundamental to grand strategy is the diplomacy through which a nation might forge alliances or pressure another nation into compliance, thereby achieving victory without resorting to combat. Another element of grand strategy is the management of the post-war peace. As Clausewitz stated, a successful military strategy may be a means to an end, but it is not an end in itself. There are numerous examples in history where victory on the battlefield has not translated into long-term peace, security, or tranquility. Principles. Many military strategists have attempted to encapsulate a successful strategy in a set of principles. Sun Tzu defined 13 principles in his The Art of War, while Napoleon listed 115 maxims. American Civil War General Nathan Bedford Forrest had only one, to their first with the most men. The concepts given as essential in the United States Army Field Manual of Military Operations, FM 30, are: objective, direct every military operation towards a clearly defined, decisive, and attainable objective. Offensive, seize, retain, and exploit the initiative. Mass, concentrate combat power at the decisive place and time. Economy of force, allocate minimum essential combat power to secondary efforts. Maneuver, place the enemy in a disadvantageous position through the flexible application of combat power. Unity of command, for every objective, ensure unity of effort under one responsible commander. Security, never permit the enemy to acquire an unexpected advantage. Surprise, strike the enemy at a time, at a place, or in a manner for which he is unprepared. Simplicity, prepare clear, uncomplicated plans and clear, concise orders to ensure thorough understanding. According to Green and Armstrong, some strategists assert adhering to the fundamental principles guarantees victory, while others claim war is unpredictable and the general must be flexible in formulating a strategy. Others argue predictability is low, but could be increased if experts were to perceive the situation from both sides in the conflict. Field Marshal Count Helmuth von Moltke expressed strategy as a system of ad hoc expedients by which a general must take action while under pressure. These underlying principles of strategy have survived relatively unscathed as the technology of warfare has developed. Strategy, and tactics, must constantly evolve in response to technological advances. A successful strategy from one era tends to remain in favor long after new developments in military weaponry and materiel have rendered it obsolete. World War I, and to a great extent the American Civil War, saw Napoleonic tactics of offense at all costs pitted against the defensive power of the trench, machine gun, and barbed wire. As a reaction to her World War I experience, France entered World War II with a purely defensive doctrine, epitomized by the impregnable Maginot Line, but only to be completely circumvented by the German Blitzkrieg in the fall of France. Development. Antiquity. The principles of military strategy emerged at least as far back as 500 BC in the works of Sun Tzu and Chanakya. The campaigns of Alexander the Great, Chandragupta Maurya, Hannibal, Qin Shi Huang, Julius Caesar, Zhuge Khalid ibn al-Walid and, in particular, Cyrus the Great demonstrate strategic planning and movement. Mahan describes in the preface to the influence of sea power upon history how the Romans used their sea power to effectively block the sea lines of communication of Hannibal with Carthage, and so via a maritime strategy achieved Hannibal's removal from Italy, despite never beating him there with their legions. One of these strategies was shown in the battle between Greek city-states and Persia. The Battle of Thermopylae, in which the Greek forces were outnumbered, stood as a good military strategy. The Greek allied forces ultimately lost the battle, but the training, use of armor, and location allowed them to defeat many Persian troops before losing. In the end, the Greek alliance lost the battle but not the war as a result of that strategy, which continued on to the Battle of Plataea. The Battle of Plataea in 479 BC resulted in a victory for the Greeks against Persia, which exemplified that military strategy was extremely beneficial to defeating a numerous enemy. Early strategies included the strategy of annihilation, exhaustion, attrition warfare, scorched earth action, blockade, guerrilla campaign, deception, and feint. Ingenuity and adeptness were limited only by imagination, accord, and technology. Strategists continually exploited ever-advancing technology. The word strategy itself derives from the Greek sigma tau rho alpha tau eta gamma alpha, strategia, office of general, command, generalship, in turn from sigma tau rho alpha tau eta gamma, strategos, leader or commander of an army, general, a compound of sigma tau rho alpha tau, stratos, army, host plus gamma, agos, leader, chief, in turn from gamma omega, ago, to lead. No evidence exists of it being used in a modern sense in ancient Greek, but we find it in Byzantine documents from the 6th century onwards, and most notably in the work attributed to Emperor Leo VI the Wise of Byzantium. Middle Ages. Genghis Khan and the Mongols. As a counterpoint to European developments in the strategic art, the Mongol Emperor Genghis Khan provides a useful example. Genghis' successes, and those of his successors, were based on maneuver and terror. The main focus of Genghis' strategic assault was the psychology of the opposing population. By steady and meticulous implementation of this strategy, Genghis and his descendants were able to conquer most of Eurasia. The building blocks of Genghis' army and his strategy were his tribal levies of mounted archers, scorched earth-style methods, and, equally essential, the vast horse herds of Mongolia. Each archer had at least one extra horse. There was an average 5 horses per man, thus the entire army could move with astounding rapidity. Moreover, since horse milk and horse blood were the staples of the Mongolian diet, Genghis' horse herds functioned not just as his means of movement but as his logistical sustainment. All other necessities would be foraged and plundered. Khan's marauders also brought with them mobile shelters, concubines, butchers, and cooks. Through maneuver and continuous assault, Chinese, Persian, Arab, and Eastern European armies could be stressed until they collapsed, and were then annihilated in pursuit and encirclement. Compared to the armies of Genghis, nearly all other armies were cumbersome and relatively static. It was not until well into the 20th century that any army was able to match the speed of deployment of Genghis' armies. When confronted with a fortified city, the Mongol imperatives of maneuver and speed required that it be quickly subdued. Here the terror engendered by the bloody reputation of the Mongolians helped to intimidate and subdue. So too did primitive biological warfare. A trebuchet or other type of ballista weapon would be used to launch dead animals and corpses into a besieged city, spreading disease and death, such as the Black Plague. If a particular town or city displeased the Mongolian Khan, everyone in the city would be killed to set an example for all other cities. This was early psychological warfare. To refer to the 9 strategic principles outlined above, the Mongol strategy was directed toward an objective, that Schwerpunkt, main focus, being the morale and mental state of the opposing population, achieved through the offensive. This offensive was itself characterized by concentration of force, maneuver, surprise, and simplicity. Early modern era. In 1520 Niccolò Machiavelli's dell'arte della guerra, Art of War, dealt with the relationship between civil and military matters and the formation of grand strategy. In the 30 Years' War, 1618–1648, Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden demonstrated advanced operational strategy that led to his victories on the soil of the Holy Roman Empire. It was not until the 18th century that military strategy was subjected to serious study in Europe. The word was first used in German as strategy in a translation of Leo's work in 1777, shortly thereafter in French as strategy by Leo's French translator, and was first attested in English 1810. In the 7 Years' War, 1756–1763, Frederick the Great improvised a strategy of exhaustion, see attrition warfare, to hold off his opponents and conserve his Prussian forces. Assailed from all sides by France, Austria, Russia, and Sweden, Frederick exploited his central position, which enabled him to move his army along interior lines and concentrate against one opponent at a time. Unable to achieve victory, he was able to stave off defeat until a diplomatic solution emerged. Frederick's victory led to great significance being placed on geometric strategy, which emphasized lines of maneuver, awareness of terrain and possession of critical strong points. Napoleonic. The French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars that followed revolutionized military strategy. The impact of this period was still to be felt in the American Civil War and the early phases of World War I. With the advent of cheap small arms and the rise of the drafted citizen soldier, armies grew rapidly in size to become massed formations. This necessitated dividing the army first into divisions and later into corps. Along with divisions came divisional artillery, lightweight, mobile cannon with great range and firepower. The rigid formations of pikemen and musketeers firing massed volleys gave way to light infantry fighting in skirmish lines. Napoleon I of France took advantage of these developments to pursue an effective battle of annihilation. Napoleon invariably sought to achieve decision in battle, with the sole aim of utterly destroying his opponent, usually achieving success through superior maneuver. As ruler and general, he dealt with the grand strategy as well as the operational strategy, making use of political and economic measures. While not the originator of the methods he used, Napoleon effectively combined the relatively superior maneuver and battle stages into one event. Before this, general officers had considered this approach to battle as separate events. However, Napoleon used the maneuver to battle to dictate how and where the battle would progress. The Battle of Austerlitz was a perfect example of this maneuver. Napoleon withdrew from a strong position to draw his opponent forward and tempt him into a flank attack, weakening his center. This allowed the French army to split the Allied army and gain victory. Napoleon used 2 primary strategies for the approach to battle. His maneuver de derrière, move on to the rear, was intended to place the French army across the enemy's lines of communications. This forced the opponent to either march to battle with Napoleon or attempt to find an escape route around the army. By placing his army into the rear, his opponent's supplies and communications would be cut. This had a negative effect on enemy morale. Once joined, the battle would be one in which his opponent could not afford defeat. This also allowed Napoleon to select multiple battle angles into a battle site. Initially, the lack of force concentration helped with foraging for food and sought to confuse the enemy as to his real location and intentions. The indirect approach into battle also allowed Napoleon to disrupt the linear formations used by the Allied armies. As the battle progressed, the enemy committed their reserves to stabilize the situation, Napoleon would suddenly release the flanking formation to attack the enemy. His opponents, being suddenly confronted with a new threat and with little reserves, had no choice but to weaken the area closest to the flanking formation and draw up a battle line at a right angle in an attempt to stop this new threat. Once this had occurred, Napoleon would mass his reserves at the hinge of that right angle and launch a heavy attack to break the lines. The rupture in the enemy lines allowed Napoleon's cavalry to flank both lines and roll them up, leaving his opponent no choice but to surrender or flee. The second strategy used by Napoleon I of France when confronted with two or more enemy armies was the use of the central position. This allowed Napoleon to drive a wedge to separate the enemy armies. He would then use part of his force to mask one army while the larger portion overwhelmed and defeated the second army quickly. He would then march on the second army, leaving a portion to pursue the first army and repeat the operations. This was designed to achieve the highest concentration of men into the primary battle while limiting the enemy's ability to reinforce the critical battle. The central position had a weakness in that the full power of the pursuit of the enemy could not be achieved because the second army needed attention. So overall, the preferred method of attack was the flank march to cross the enemy's logistics. Napoleon used the central position strategy during the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon masked Wellington and massed against the Prussian army, and then after the Battle of Ligny was won, Napoleon attempted to do the same to the Allied/British army located just to the south of Waterloo. His subordinate was unable to mask the defeated Prussian army, who reinforced the Waterloo battle in time to defeat Napoleon and end his domination of Europe. It can be said that the Prussian army under Blücher used the manœuvre de derrière against Napoleon, who was suddenly placed in a position of reacting to a new enemy threat. Napoleon's practical strategic triumphs, repeatedly leading smaller forces to defeat larger ones, inspired a whole new field of study into military strategy. In particular, his opponents were keen to develop a body of knowledge in this area to allow them to counteract a masterful individual with a highly competent group of officers, a general staff. The two most significant students of his work were Karl von Clausewitz, a Prussian with a background in philosophy, and Antoine-Henri Jomini, who had been one of Napoleon's staff officers. One notable exception to Napoleon's strategy of annihilation and a precursor to trench warfare were the lines of Torres-Vidras during the Peninsular War. French armies lived off the land, and when they were confronted by a line of fortifications which they could not outflank, they were unable to continue the advance and were forced to retreat once they had consumed all the provisions of the region in front of the lines. The Peninsular Campaign was notable for the development of another method of warfare which went largely unnoticed at the time, but would become far more common in the 20th century. That was the aid and encouragement the British gave to the Spanish to harass the French behind their lines, which led them to squander most of the assets of their Iberian army in protecting the army's line of communications. This was a very cost-effective move for the British, because it cost far less to aid Spanish insurgents than it did to equip and pay regular British army units to engage the same number of French troops. As the British army could be correspondingly smaller, it was able to supply its troops by sea and land without having to live off the land as was the norm at the time. Further, because they did not have to forage, they did not antagonize the locals and so did not have to garrison their lines of communications to the same extent as the French did. So the strategy of aiding their Spanish civilian allies in their guerrilla or small war benefited the British in many ways, not all of which were immediately obvious. Clausewitz and Jomini. Clausewitz's On War has become the respected reference for strategy, dealing with political, as well as military, leadership. His most famous assertion being, "War is not merely a political act, but also a real political instrument, a continuation of policy carried out by other means." For Clausewitz, war was first and foremost a political act, and thus the purpose of all strategy was to achieve the political goal that the state was seeking to accomplish. As such, Clausewitz famously argued that war was the continuation of politics by other means, and as such, argued that the amount of force used by the state would and should be proportional to whatever the political aim that the state was seeking to achieve via war. Clausewitz further dismissed geometry as an insignificant factor in strategy, believing instead that ideally all wars should follow the Napoleonic concept of victory through a decisive battle of annihilation and destruction of the opposing force, at any cost. However, he also recognized that his ideal of how war should be fought was not always practical in reality, and that limited warfare could influence policy by wearing down the opposition through a strategy of attrition. In contrast to Clausewitz, Antoine-Henri Jomini dealt mainly with operational strategy, planning and intelligence, the conduct of the campaign, and generalship rather than statesmanship. He proposed that victory could be achieved by occupying the enemy's territory rather than destroying his army. As such, geometric considerations were prominent in his theory of strategy. Jomini's two basic principles of strategy were to concentrate against fractions of the enemy force at a time and to strike at the most decisive objective. Clausewitz and Jomini are required reading for today's military professional officer. Industrial Age. The evolution of military strategy continued in the American Civil War, 1861–65. The practice of strategy was advanced by generals such as Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, all of whom had been influenced by the feats of Napoleon. Thomas Stonewall Jackson was said to have carried a book of Napoleon's maxims with him. However, the adherence to the Napoleonic principles in the face of technological advances such as the long-range infantry breech-loader rifles and mini-ball guns generally led to disastrous consequences for both the Union and Confederate forces and populace. The time and space in which war was waged changed as well. Railroads enabled swift movement of large forces, but the maneuvering was constrained to narrow, vulnerable corridors. Steam power and ironclads changed transport and combat at sea. Newly invented telegraph enabled more rapid communication between armies and their headquarters capitals. Combat was still usually waged by opposing divisions with skirmish lines on rural battlefields, violent naval engagements by cannon-armed sailing or steam-powered vessels, an assault on military forces defending a town. There was still room for triumphs for the strategy of maneuver such as Sherman's march to the sea in 1864, but these depended upon an enemy's unwillingness to entrench. Towards the end of the war, especially in defense of static targets as in the battles of Cold Harbor and Vicksburg, trench networks foreshadowed World War I. Many of the lessons of the American Civil War were forgotten, when in wars like the Austro-Prussian War or the Franco-Prussian War, maneuver won the day. In the period preceding World War I, two of the most influential strategists were the Prussian generals, Helmuth von Moltke and Alfred von Schlieffen. Under Moltke the Prussian army achieved victory in the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War, 1870–71, the latter campaign being widely regarded as a classic example of the conception and execution of military strategy. In addition to exploiting railroads and highways for maneuver, Moltke also exploited the telegraph for control of large armies. He recognized the need to delegate control to subordinate commanders and to issue directives rather than specific orders. Moltke is most remembered as a strategist for his belief in the need for flexibility and that no plan, however well prepared, can be guaranteed to survive beyond the first encounter with the enemy. Field Marshal Schlieffen succeeded Moltke and directed German planning in the lead-up to World War I. He advocated the strategy of annihilation but was faced by a war on two fronts against numerically superior opposition. The strategy he formulated was the Schlieffen Plan, defending in the east while concentrating for a decisive victory in the west, after which the Germans would go on to the offensive in the east. Influenced by Hannibal's success at the Battle of Cannae, Schlieffen planned for a single great battle of encirclement, thereby annihilating his enemy. Another German strategist of the period was Hans Delbrück, who expanded on Clausewitz's concept of limited warfare to produce a theory on the strategy of exhaustion. His theory defied popular military thinking of the time, which was strongly in favor of victory in battle, yet World War I would soon demonstrate the flaws of a mindless strategy of annihilation. At a time when industrialization was rapidly changing naval technology, one American strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, almost single-handedly brought the field of naval strategy up to date. Influenced by Jomini's principles of strategy, he saw that in the coming wars, where economic strategy could be as important as military strategy, control of the sea granted the power to control the trade and resources needed to wage war. Mahan pushed the concept of the big navy in an expansionist view where defense was achieved by controlling the sea approaches rather than fortifying the coast. His theories contributed to the naval arms race between 1898 and 1914. World War I. At the start of World War I, strategy was dominated by the offensive thinking that had been in vogue since 1870, despite the more recent experiences of the Second Boer War, 1899–1902, and Russo-Japanese War, 1904–05, where the machine gun demonstrated its defensive capabilities. By the end of 1914, the Western Front was a stalemate and all ability to maneuver strategically was lost. The combatants resorted to a strategy of attrition. The German battle at Verdun, the British on the Somme and at Passchendaele were among the first wide-scale battles intended to wear down the enemy. Attrition was time-consuming, so the duration of World War I battles often stretched to weeks and months. The problem with attrition was that the use of fortified defenses in depth generally required a ratio of 10 attackers to 1 defender, or a level of artillery support which was simply not feasible until late 1917, for any reasonable chance of victory. The ability of the defender to move troops using interior lines prevented the possibility of fully exploiting any breakthrough with the level of technology then attainable. Perhaps Th.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.